The leather binding of the expedition logbook was stiff with dried salt and something darker that had soaked into the spine. When I opened it on the examination table, the pages crackled like dry leaves. The handwriting began in precise, dark ink, meticulously recording barometric pressure and wind speed at the top of the world. By the final pages, it had degraded to a faint, erratic pencil scrawl. This was the official record of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition. In August 1881, First Lieutenant Adolphus W. Greely and 24 men established Fort Conger on the northern coast of Ellesmere Island. 3 years later, at a desolate rock outcropping called Cape Sabine, searchers found what was left of them. The ink tells us what they measured. The pencil tells. I reviewed the original orders issued by Chief Signal Officer General William Hazen. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition was not designed as a rescue mission or a simple dash for the North Pole. It was the United States' contribution to the first International Polar Year, a coordinated effort by 11 nations to establish a ring of scientific observation stations around the Arctic Circle. The underlying theory, proposed by the Austrian naval officer Karl Weiprecht, was that simultaneous meteorological and magnetic readings across the polar region would unlock the mechanics of global weather. First Lieutenant Adolphus W. Greely of the 5th Cavalry was selected to command the American station. Greely was 37 years old, a veteran of the Civil War, and a seasoned officer in the Signal Corps. He had spent years laying telegraph lines through the American West, a man accustomed to strict military discipline and precise data collection. He was methodical, rigid, and deeply committed to the scientific mandate. The roster he assembled consisted of 3 officers, 1 acting medical officer named Dr. Octave Pavy, and 21 enlisted men, primarily drawn from the cavalry and infantry. They were soldiers, not seasoned Arctic explorers. The equipment they packed reflected the mission's scientific focus. I read the manifests detailing the instruments loaded into the cargo holds: standard mercurial thermometers, maximum and minimum thermometers, aneroid barometers, anemometers for measuring wind velocity, and dip circles for recording magnetic variation. Their orders were explicit. They were to proceed to Lady Franklin Bay on the eastern coast of Ellesmere Island, establish a permanent station at 81 degrees 44 minutes north latitude, and record continuous observations for 2 years. The orders also contained a strict contingency plan. General Hazen stipulated that a resupply vessel would be sent in the summer of 1882 and another in 1883. If the 1883 vessel failed to reach them by early September, Greely was ordered to abandon the station and retreat southward along the coast in small boats until he met the relief ship or reached a cache of supplies. It was a rigid directive, written by men in Washington who had never seen the ice pack of Kane Basin. Greely, a soldier to his corps, accepted the orders without question. The expedition departed St. John's, Newfoundland, on July 7, 1881, aboard the steam sealer Proteus. She was a stout wooden vessel of 467 tons, commanded by Captain Richard Pike, a veteran ice navigator. The cargo manifests I examined showed a heavily burdened ship. They carried 140 tons of coal, a prefabricated wooden house measuring 60 feet long by 21 feet wide, and 36,000 pounds of provisions designed to last the 25 men for 3 years. They also carried 2 wooden whaleboats, a 27-foot steam launch named the Lady Greely, and a pack of sled dogs acquired in Greenland. The journey north through Baffin Bay, Smith Sound, and the narrow Kennedy Channel was remarkably swift. The ice, which often choked these waterways, was unusually open that summer. On August 11, 1881, the Proteus dropped anchor in Discovery Harbor, a sheltered inlet within Lady Franklin Bay. The men immediately began unloading the cargo onto the rocky shore. Within days, they erected the prefabricated structure, naming it Fort Conger. The building was double-walled, with tar paper packed between the wooden planks to insulate against the coming winter. The Proteus remained at anchor for 2 weeks, her crew assisting with the construction and the stockpiling of coal. On August 26th, Captain Pike gave the order to weigh anchor. The Proteus sounded her whistle, turned south, and steamed away through the ice-free channel. Greely and his 24 men stood on the shoreline and watched the ship disappear beyond the headland. They were now entirely isolated, more than 1,000 miles north of the Arctic Circle, with no means of communication with the outside world. The routine at Fort Conger began immediately. Greely instituted a strict military schedule. The men were divided into shifts to ensure that the scientific instruments were monitored 24 hours a day. Every hour, on the hour, an observer walked out to the instrument shelter to record the temperature, the barometric pressure, the wind speed, and the magnetic variation. They recorded the data in heavy, leather-bound ledgers. The first winter descended in October, plunging the station into 4 months of continuous darkness. The temperature dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Fort Conger, the men read by oil lamps, repaired sledges, and prepared for the spring exploration season. They were well-fed, warm, and secure in their wooden fortress. When the sun returned in the spring of 1882, Greely initiated the exploration phase of the mission. The primary objective was to push north along the uncharted coast of Greenland. On April 4, 1882, Lieutenant James B. Lockwood, Sergeant David L. Brainerd, and an Inuk dog driver named Frederick Christensen departed Fort Conger with a team of dogs and a heavily loaded sledge. I tracked their route through Brainerd's field journal. They crossed the frozen Robeson Channel to the Greenland coast and began a grueling march northward over fractured sea ice and deep snow. The temperature hovered around -30 degrees. They traveled for weeks, mapping the coastline and establishing supply depots. On May 13, 1882, they reached a desolate promontory they named Lockwood Island. Brainerd unrolled a small silk American flag and tied it to a makeshift staff. He took a reading with his sextant. The latitude was 83 degrees, 24 minutes north. They had surpassed the British record set by Commander Albert Markham in 1876. For the first time in 3 centuries, a nation other than Great Britain held the record for the farthest north. They returned to Fort Conger in June, exhausted but victorious. The summer of 1882 brought the expectation of the first resupply ship. Greely and his men scanned the southern horizon for the smoke of a steamer. They did not know that the relief ship Neptune, commanded by William M. Beebe, had encountered a massive, impenetrable wall of ice in Kane Basin, 200 miles south of Fort Conger. Beebe made several attempts to ram through the pack, but the ice held firm. Following his own orders, Beebe retreated in early September. Before turning south, he landed at Cape Sabine and established a small cache containing 250 rations of meat and bread. At Fort Conger, August turned to September, and the open water began to freeze. Greely realized the ship was not coming. The mood in the station shifted, but there was no immediate panic. They had sufficient provisions to last through a second winter. The scientific observations continued without interruption. Every hour, the men recorded the data. The second winter passed much like the first, marked by darkness, routine, and the steady accumulation of meteorological records. But the failure of the 1882 resupply, the summer of 1883 arrived, and the ice in the channel remained solid. The second relief expedition, commanded by Lieutenant Ernest Garlington, sailed north in the Proteus, the same ship that had delivered Greely 2 years earlier. On July 23, 1883, near Cape Sabine, the Proteus was caught in a sudden movement of the ice pack. The heavy floes crushed her wooden hull. The crew abandoned ship, salvaging what little they could before the Proteus sank. Garlington and his men retreated south in small boats, leaving a meager cache of supplies and a note in a cairn at Cape Sabine detailing the disaster. At Fort Conger, Greely knew nothing of this. He only knew that August had arrived, and no ship had appeared. He consulted the orders written by General Hazen. The directive was unambiguous. If not resupplied by early August 1883, the expedition was to abandon Fort Conger and retreat southward by boat. Dr. Pavey and several of the men argued against leaving. Fort Conger was warm, secure, and still held a substantial amount of coal and some provisions. To abandon it for a perilous journey through the shifting ice seemed reckless. But Greely was a soldier. He would not disobey a direct written order. On August 9, 1883, the 25 men boarded the steam launch Lady Greely and 3 small whaleboats. They loaded 40 days of standard rations, their sleeping bags, their rifles, and the heavy iron-bound footlocker containing the scientific ledgers. They left the wooden house behind and steered south into the ice pack. The journey was a slow, brutal struggle. The distance to Cape Sabine was 250 miles. The ice was in constant motion, opening into narrow leads of black water and then slamming shut. They navigated the boats through the crushing flows, often hauling them out of the water onto the ice to avoid being pulverized. By late August, the ice froze solid around them. They were forced to abandon the steam launch and drag the smaller boats across the jagged surface of the pack. The temperatures dropped. Their clothing, constantly wet from sea spray and sweat, froze stiff. For 51 days, they drifted on the shifting ice floes, carried by the currents, moving slowly toward the barren. In late September 1883, the ice carried them close enough to the shore to make a desperate crossing. They made landfall near Cape Sabine, a desolate, wind-scoured peninsula of shattered rock. On October 9th, a scouting party located the stone cairn left by Lieutenant Garlington. Inside, they found the note. I read the transcription of that note in the official inquiry. It stated plainly that the Proteus had been crushed and sunk, that Garlington was retreating south, and that a small cache of supplies had been left nearby. The reality of their situation settled over the 25 men. There was no rescue ship waiting. There was no winter quarters prepared. They were stranded on a barren rock with winter approaching. They scoured the coastline and located the scattered caches left by the Neptune in 1882 and the Proteus crew in 1883. When they inventoried the total provisions, the numbers were grim. They had roughly 1,000 pounds of meat, some bread, and a small amount of tea and extractive beef. It was enough standard rations to feed 25 men for perhaps 40 days. They had to survive for 8 months until the ice cleared the following summer. Greely selected a site on a low, rocky isthmus and ordered the construction of a winter shelter. They called it Camp Clay. They gathered loose stones and built a rectangular wall, 3 feet high, measuring 25 feet long by 17 feet wide. Across the top of these low walls, they laid an overturned whaleboat to serve as a ridgepole. They stretched canvas sails over the boat and weighed the edges down with rocks and gravel. There was no wood for a floor, only the frozen earth. 25 men crawled into this dark, low space. They lay shoulder to shoulder in their canvas sleeping bags, unable to stand upright. Greely took inventory of the food and made the calculation. To stretch the provisions until spring, he reduced the daily allowance to 14 ounces of food per man. A standard military ration was over 40 ounces. They were entering the polar winter on a starvation diet. The temperature inside the shelter dropped below freezing. The condensation from their breath froze on the canvas roof, forming a thick layer of frost that occasionally broke loose and fell on their sleeping bag. By November 1883, the sun disappeared entirely. The daily ration was cut again, dropping to 10 ounces, then 8. The men remained in their sleeping bags for 20 hours a day to conserve body heat and energy. I examined the quartermaster logs kept by Sergeant Brainerd. He issued the rations using a small brass scale, measuring out fractions of an ounce of moldy bread and rancid meat. When the meat ran out, they boiled the seal skin that had been used to line their boots. They scraped rock lichen, known as tripe de roche, from the boulders outside. They constructed small nets from burlap and lowered them through cracks in the ice to catch tiny, shrimp-like amphipods they called sand fleas. A day's labor in the freezing wind might yield 3 ounces of fleas, which they boiled into a thin, bitter stew. The first man died on January 18, 1884. Sergeant William Cross succumbed to scurvy and malnutrition. They buried him in a shallow trench scraped into the gravel. In April, the Inuk driver Christensen died. Then Sergeant Lynn. The deaths came steadily after that. Despite the starvation, Greely maintained military discipline. The scientific observations continued, though reduced in frequency. The men were forbidden to eat outside of the issued rations. But hunger destroys the mind as surely as the body. Private Charles B. Henry, a man with a history of disciplinary issues, was caught stealing from the communal stores. He stole seal skin, and later, he stole from the remaining rations of bacon. Greely issued written warnings, stating that any man caught stealing food would be shot. Henry ignored the warnings. On June 5th, he was caught stealing again. Greely realized that Henry's actions threatened the survival of the few remaining men. On June 6, 1884, Greely wrote a formal, unsealed order. He handed it to 3 of his most trusted men, Sergeant Brainerd, Sergeant Frederick, and Private Long. The order commanded them to execute Private Henry. They took Henry from the collapsed tent. 2 shots were fired. The execution was logged in the official record. By mid-June, the daily ration was gone entirely. The men were eating the leather from their boots and the oil-tanned covers of their sleeping bags. Only 7 men remained alive. They lay in the collapsed ruins of the canvas tent. On June 22, 1884, Commander Winfield Scott Schley arrived in Kane Basin commanding the relief ships Thetis and Bear. A heavy gale was battering Cape Sabine. A search party went ashore and located the cairn containing Garlington's note, and beneath it, a smaller note left by Greely indicating the location of Camp Clay. The searchers pushed through the howling wind toward the isthmus. Inside the collapsed tent, Sergeant Brainerd thought he heard a ship's whistle over the gale. He crawled out from under the canvas, scanned the gray, empty water, and saw nothing. He crawled back inside to die. Hours later, the rescuers reached the site. They found the canvas roof pinned down by rocks. They cut through the fabric with knives. I read the account of the first rescuer to look inside. He saw a man in a tattered sleeping bag, his face black with soot and dirt, reading from a book of common prayer. It was Greely. 6 other men were alive, emaciated to the bone, their joints swollen with scurvy. The bodies of the dead lay scattered on the rocks outside, some in shallow graves, others simply left where they fell. The rescuers carried the 7 survivors to the ships. One of them, Corporal Joseph Ellison, died weeks later from severe frostbite and amputations, leaving only 6 men to return to the United States. Before leaving Camp Clay, the search party recovered the heavy, iron-bound footlocker. Inside were the expedition's ledgers. Through the retreat, the starvation, and the dying, the men had preserved 500 pages of unbroken meteorological and magnetic data. The scientific record was complete. The cost of those numbers was 19 dead men. The ledgers reside now in the National Archives, the ink still dark, the pencil scrawls still legible. We know the exact barometric pressure at Fort Conger on a Tuesday in November. We know the exact weight of the rations issued at Camp Clay. But what passed through the minds of those men in the dark, under the freezing canvas, as they watched each other slowly disappear, remains entirely unknown. If these stories of vanished crews and silent ships speak to you, subscribe to